Somewhere during the 9th century, high in the mountains of what is now Sichuan or Shanxi province in China, a group of Taoist alchemists were working on a project that had nothing to do with battle. Their goal was eternal life. They believed that if they combined the right minerals in the right proportions, they could brew a potion that would let a person live forever. So they spent years mixing powders, heating them over flame, and testing formulas passed down through generations of healers and mystics. One day, a batch made of 3 simple ingredients came together: saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur. Instead of producing eternal life, the mixture did something far more startling. It blew up. Old records mention scorched beards and workshops burned to the ground, which gives a pretty clear picture of how that first reaction must have gone. Nobody in that room set out to build a weapon. They named the substance Huiyao, fire medicine, a name that still hints at its original job as a failed cure rather than a tool of war. Yet that one singed beard accident, born from a failed immortality formula, would go on to become the most important chemical breakthrough in the history of warfare. It was the starting point for every gun, every cannon, and every firearm that followed. So how did we get from a failed potion in a Taoist workshop to the modern firearm? The path runs through bamboo tubes lashed to spears, a siege that proved this new substance actually worked in combat, centuries of gradual improvement, and a slow spread of knowledge across an entire continent, one that eventually shifted the balance of military power everywhere people lived. Let's start with what that original gunpowder mixture actually was, in the plainest terms possible, because the basic chemistry explains everything that came afterward. The alchemist's mixture combined potassium nitrate, saltpeter, with charcoal and sulfur, in a ratio of roughly 75 to 15 to 10 by weight. Saltpeter acted as an oxidizer. It released oxygen quickly once heated, feeding a fast burn that produced a sudden burst of expanding gas. That expanding gas is the whole secret behind everything gunpowder would later be used for, whether that meant shooting fireworks into the sky or firing a metal ball through a tube with enough force to pierce armor. In its earliest days, gunpowder wasn't a weapon at all. It showed up in fireworks, smoke signals, and festival displays, exactly the kind of colorful, celebratory use you'd expect from something first discovered by monks chasing immortality rather than generals chasing victory. For generations, ordinary people across China knew this substance mainly as a spectacle, lighting up festivals and religious events with flashes of color and sound that had nothing to do with fighting. That began to shift once Song Dynasty military leaders saw what this unstable new material could really do. Sometime between the 10th and 12th centuries, Chinese engineers built something called the huichang, or fire lance. Its design was about as basic as a weapon could get. Take a bamboo tube, tie it securely to the end of a spear, fill it with gunpowder, and light it during close-quarters fighting. The result was a spear that also spat fire and burning debris at anyone standing within striking distance, turning an ordinary polearm into something far more frightening to face up close. Defenders relied on fire lances during the siege of Din in 1132, when attackers were scaling their walls, and by most accounts the weapon did exactly what it was meant to do, scorching and confusing attackers in ways an ordinary spear never could. The psychological effect mattered just as much as the physical one. Soldiers trained their whole lives to fight with blades and spears suddenly faced an enemy who could throw fire itself, and that kind of shock often counted for as much on a medieval battlefield as actual wounds. Once gunpowder had proven itself in real combat, improvements came quickly, and each new step followed logically from the one before it. Fire lance builders began packing pellets and broken pottery shards into the bamboo tubes along with the powder, turning a weapon that once just produced flame into one that also hurled small projectiles with real force. This was a major conceptual shift. It moved the weapon's purpose away from pure intimidation and burning, toward actual piercing injury delivered from a distance. That idea became the foundation for every firearm that followed. The next big obstacle was the bamboo itself, which couldn't hold up under the pressure that stronger gunpowder charges created, often splitting apart in the user's hands. Once Chinese craftsmen figured out how to cast bronze tubes strong enough to contain that pressure safely, the hand cannon was born. A weapon that used the expanding gas from burning gunpowder to fire a single solid projectile with far more force and range than any bamboo fire lance ever managed. By the 13th century, metal-barreled hand cannons were already in regular use across China, marking a real leap forward in both reliability and effectiveness compared with the earlier bamboo weapons. Chinese engineers also scaled the same basic idea up, building devices with names like the thunderclap bomb and the heaven-shaking cannon, weapons capable of producing genuinely powerful explosions and breaking down fortified positions that had once seemed unbreakable. When the Mongols invaded China in the 1200s, they ran into these gunpowder weapons directly, in sieges like the defense of Kaifeng in 1232, and the encounter left a strong impression. Rather than simply being beaten by the new technology, the Mongols absorbed it. Once they had conquered China and set up the Yuan dynasty, they carried gunpowder weapons westward with them, as their conquests expanded across Asia and toward the Islamic world. This is one of history's more significant and often overlooked cases of technology transfer, because Mongol military campaigns worked almost like an unintentional delivery network, spreading gunpowder knowledge across huge distances far faster than trade routes or diplomatic missions ever could have on their own, carrying a Chinese invention across the whole of Eurasia within just a few generations. It's also worth noting that gunpowder weapons didn't evolve along one single path during this period. Alongside hand cannons and fire lances, Chinese engineers also developed rockets and fire arrows, gunpowder-driven projectiles that found use not only in China, but eventually in Korea and India as well, moving along separate but overlapping routes from the hand cannon's own path west. These rocket weapons never disappeared the way the fire lance eventually did once true guns matured. Instead, they survived as a separate branch of gunpowder technology, one that would reappear centuries later in European warfare and much later still in the earliest ancestors of modern rocketry and space travel. The story of gunpowder, in other words, doesn't lead to a single outcome. It splits into two paths, one toward the firearm, one toward the rocket, both rooted in the same accidental discovery made by alchemists, who wanted nothing to do with either one. From there, gunpowder spread outward along several overlapping routes at once, reaching the Islamic world and eventually Europe through a mix of military contact, trade, and a broader wave of cross-cultural exchange that marked the 13th and 14th centuries. Historians studying this era point to a wider pattern worth noticing. Gunpowder wasn't the only major Chinese invention traveling west during this stretch of time. Paper, printing, and the magnetic compass all moved along similar routes during roughly the same centuries, part of a much larger flow of knowledge moving from east to west long before anyone had coined the word. Globalization. Some historians have pointed out that early European cannons look so structurally similar to Chinese designs that a direct transfer of knowledge seems far more likely than two cultures independently landing on nearly identical solutions by coincidence. Once the technology reached Europe in the late 13th century, it entered a political and military world that gunpowder weapons would, over the following centuries, completely reshape, eventually breaking down systems of feudal military power that had held for hundreds of years. The change wasn't immediate. Early European hand cannons, much like their Chinese predecessors, were rough, slow to reload, and hard to aim with any real accuracy, essentially a small cannon awkwardly mounted on a pole. A soldier loaded powder and shot into the open end, touched a smoldering ember or slow-burning cord to a small hole, and hoped, with more optimism than certainty, that the blast would send the projectile somewhere useful. Even in this rough early form, though, the weapon carried an impact that traditional melee weapons simply couldn't match. Castle walls that had held off siege equipment for generations began giving way to cannon fire. Mounted knights in heavy armor, the dominant military force across medieval Europe for centuries, found themselves increasingly exposed to a weapon that didn't care how much steel a person wore, since enough gunpowder-driven force could punch straight through it regardless. The entire social and military order built around expensive, heavily armored cavalry began to crack, because a relatively cheap weapon in the hands of a far less expensively trained soldier could now neutralize an opponent who had spent a lifetime and a fortune preparing for combat the traditional way. This shift reached well beyond the battlefield, reshaping the very architecture of European warfare. As cannons grew steadily stronger and more effective against tall stone walls, the traditional castle design, built around thin, high walls meant to repel scaling attackers and arrows, became dangerously outdated almost overnight in historical terms. Military engineers responded by developing the Star Fort and the Bastion, lower, angled, heavily reinforced fortifications built specifically to deflect and absorb cannon fire instead of simply standing tall and hoping for the best. The medieval castle, a structure that had dominated European landscapes for centuries, was gradually replaced by fortifications that looked almost nothing like it, all because of a weapon that had originated half a world away, in the hands of monks chasing eternal life. The next major leap came in the late 15th century with the invention of the matchlock mechanism, and this single development is what finally turned gunpowder weapons from clumsy novelties into the backbone of organized infantry warfare across the continent. The core problem with earlier hand cannons was that firing one required two hands and a lot of coordination, one hand to steady the weapon, the other to apply a burning ember or core directly to the touch hole at exactly the right moment, all while trying to aim at a moving target in the middle of a chaotic fight. The matchlock solved this cleanly by attaching a slow-burning cord, held in a curved clamp called a serpentine, directly to the weapon itself. Pulling the trigger lowered that already lit cord into a small pan of priming powder, setting off the main charge automatically, and freeing the shooter to hold and aim the weapon with both hands right up until the moment of firing. It sounds like a small mechanical tweak, but it was genuinely transformative. It was the first mechanical firing device ever built into a small arm, and for the first time in history it let a single trained soldier fire a gunpowder weapon with some real accuracy, rather than simply pointing in the general direction of the enemy and hoping for the best. By the early 15th century, matchlock arquebuses were showing up in growing numbers across Western Europe, especially in Spain, France, and the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, and the weapon spread quickly from there across all of Eurasia. The Ottoman Empire, already familiar with gunpowder weapons since the 14th century, built matchlocks directly into the elite Janissary corps that formed the backbone of Ottoman military strength, using the weapon with great effect in battles such as Goa in 1510, alongside Portuguese forces, who also depended heavily on matchlock weaponry during that same period. In 1543, Portuguese traders brought matchlock technology to Japan, where local gunsmiths refined the design so thoroughly that Japanese matchlocks, known as tanegashima, came to be regarded as among the finest crafted firearms anywhere in the world at the time, admired for their precision and craftsmanship even by European observers. China itself, having kicked off this entire chain of innovation centuries earlier, ended up reabsorbing an improved version of its own invention, developing matchlock weapons known as bird guns specifically to counter ongoing Mongol raids along its northern frontier, a strange but fitting historical loop for a technology that began as a failed immortality potion in that same general region. Matchlock muskets eventually grew heavy and powerful enough to need a forked rest just to support the barrel while aiming, weighing as much as 25 pounds in some versions, but capable of punching through plate armor at ranges that made swords and pikes increasingly irrelevant on an open battlefield. Because loading and firing a matchlock took real time, and because the shooter was briefly exposed during that process, musketeers typically needed protection from close combat, usually provided by pikemen fighting alongside them. This pairing of pikes and shot came to dominate European battlefields from the 16th into the early 17th century, an elaborate, carefully coordinated tactical system that required extensive training, with musketeers firing from behind or between rows of pikemen in tight formations. Outside Europe, many armies that adopted matchlocks kept their traditional formations rather than developing the same dense, disciplined infantry coordination, lacking either the resources or the specific tactical push that drove European armies toward this particular style of combined arms warfare. The matchlock had one obvious and persistent weakness that everyone using it understood immediately: it needed an open, slow-burning flame at all times, which made it nearly useless in wet weather, gave away a soldier's position in the dark, and required constant attention to the burning cord even when nothing was happening on the battlefield at all. The fix arrived gradually, through a few intermediate steps worth understanding. The wheellock, developed in the early 16th century, used a spring-loaded wheel spinning rapidly against a piece of pyrite to produce sparks, removing the need for a constantly burning cord entirely. This made wheellocks far more practical for cavalry, who needed a weapon they could carry loaded and ready without tending an open flame on horseback, and both German mercenaries and English cavalry units became strongly associated with this mechanism during the 16th and early 17th centuries. But wheellocks were costly and mechanically complicated to build, which kept them from ever fully replacing the cheaper, simpler matchlock among ordinary infantry, who kept carrying the older, more affordable design well into the following century, even as wealthier cavalrymen rode with the newer alternative. The real breakthrough came with the flintlock, generally credited to French gunsmith Marin Le Bourgeois, who developed the mechanism in its recognizable modern form around 1610 to 1615. The flintlock used a spring-loaded hammer holding a piece of flint, which struck a steel surface called a frizzen to throw sparks directly into the priming pan, igniting the charge. It was faster to use than a matchlock, far more reliable in bad weather, and needed no open flame to maintain at all, which also meant soldiers no longer gave away their position at night simply by carrying a lit weapon. By the 1630s, the flintlock mechanism had spread rapidly across Europe, with the Dutch States Army among the first to formally adopt it as standard-issue infantry equipment. Within a few decades it had become the dominant firearm mechanism across nearly every major European military, a position it held for roughly 2 centuries, straight through colonial expansion, the Napoleonic Wars, and the American Revolution, where flintlock muskets carried by both colonial militias and British regulars defined the entire conflict from start to finish. The flintlock's arrival coincided with another genuinely important innovation, the socket bayonet, introduced in the late 17th century, which attached around the outside of the barrel with a metal ring rather than plugging directly into the muzzle the way earlier plug bayonets had, a design that had made the gun unable to fire while the bayonet was attached. This seemingly small change meant a soldier could fix a bayonet to his musket and still fire it normally, combining ranged firepower and close combat in a single weapon for the first time. The practical effect was enormous. Armies no longer needed dedicated pikemen standing alongside their musketeers for protection, since every soldier carrying a flintlock and bayonet could now act as both shooter and spearman depending on what the moment called for. This combined development, sometimes called the infantry revolution, simplified training, simplified logistics, and reshaped how European armies organized themselves on the battlefield, letting regiments become more flexible and able to fight at range or in close combat without needing to reorganize between the two modes. The bayonet charge also carried its own psychological weight, since the sight of an advancing line with fixed bayonets often broke enemy morale before a single shot or thrust ever landed. The flintlock's roughly 2-century run finally ended in the early 19th century with the arrival of the percussion cap system, a small metal cap containing a shock-sensitive chemical compound that ignited instantly when struck by a hammer, removing the need for loose priming powder, flint, and steel altogether. This final ignition innovation made every earlier mechanism, matchlock, wheellock, and flintlock alike, essentially outdated within a few decades, marking the last major milestone in the long chain of refinements that had begun with monks chasing immortality in 9th century China. From there, change only sped up, leading toward repeating rifles, rapid advances in metallurgy and manufacturing, and eventually weapons that would have been completely unrecognizable to soldiers who once stood in disciplined lines with pikes and matchlocks, waiting for their turn to fire. Looking back across this entire arc, from a Taoist alchemy workshop in 9th century China to flintlock muskets dominating European battlefields nearly 8 centuries later, the story of how humans invented guns is really a story about accident, accumulation, and migration, all unfolding together across an enormous span of time. Nobody set out on day one to invent the firearm. A group of monks searching for eternal life stumbled onto an explosive chemical reaction and very nearly burned their own beards off in the process. Military engineers, who watched that explosive reaction, gradually realized its force could be directed, first through a tube tied to a spear, then through a cast bronze cylinder, then through increasingly refined mechanical systems built to set off that same basic chemical reaction more reliably, more quickly, and with less risk to the person holding the weapon. Each individual improvement, the shift from bamboo to bronze, from open flame to spring-loaded mechanism, from matchlock to flintlock, solved a specific practical problem that soldiers and engineers had actually run into with the version that came before it. None of it required one single flash of genius. It took centuries of gradual refinement, carried across continents by trade routes, military campaigns, and the kind of slow cultural exchange that quietly reshapes the world while nobody's watching closely enough to notice it happening in real time, passing between Chinese engineers, Mongol conquerors, Ottoman janissaries, Japanese gunsmiths, and European craftsmen, each group adding its own touch along the way. The gun that would eventually end the dominance of mounted knights, reshape castle architecture, and ultimately help decide the outcome of colonial conquests and continental wars across multiple centuries, began its existence as a mistake made by people who were never trying to build a weapon at all.